Testing. Can everybody hear me okay? Audio good? All right. Well, let's get started. I'm John Harmon, and this is part 2 of my Bible and Time and Space lecture. And so for anybody who wasn't here last week, I'm going to provide a little bit of my background and also do sort of the Cliff's Notes version of what we did last week for anybody who missed it or for anybody who needs a kind of a refresher because we covered a lot. So I'm what I'm what used to be called a biblical archaeologist. That term's kind of gone out of fashion because a lot of really questionable work got done under the guise of biblical archaeology. So now we don't really like to call it that, but most people know what we're talking about when I say biblical archaeology. So I've been doing that for 17 years now. A couple people last week asked about my education background, so I thought I might just mention that real quickly. So I started out in history and Bible, and then went into archaeology. So my BA was history and biblical studies, and then my MA was biblical studies. And then I got a THM with an emphasis in Old Testament. And then this December, I'm scheduled to graduate with my PhD in ancient Near Eastern archaeology. So, yeah, thanks. I'm excited. Michelle, my wife Michelle's excited. But so I started out as a Bible and history guy, always had an interest in archaeology, and then somewhere along the line I shifted to being more of an archaeology guy. But I've been digging in Israel since 2008, and then my most recent project was in Sudan, where I excavated at a Kushite pyramid site. So I'll talk about the projects I was involved with as they're relevant to the discussion. And from there, let me run through a real brief kind of synopsis of last week's talk. So we discussed how there's not a whole lot archaeology has to say about the Bible up until we get about to Abraham's time, and then we can start identifying people and places. And so that's probably the Middle Bronze Age. Abraham was probably born around the year 2000 BC, maybe 1900 BC. Nobody really knows, but sometime in that ballpark. And if you'll notice the chart on the left, Abraham missed the whole Egyptian Old Kingdom and the whole Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia. And so that kind of all happened off screen from the biblical perspective. And that's worth keeping in mind, that this was a big old world, even from the biblical patriarchs' perspective. So real briefly, the patriarchs are basically the Middle Bronze Age, which corresponds to the Egyptian Middle Kingdom and Hyksos period. And then the Israelites' captivity in Egypt, and then the Exodus basically corresponds to the Late Bronze Age. Oh, I think I scrolled too far. Let's see. There we go. So if you were here last week, you'll remember this map, and if not, this is a really helpful map because this is basically the biblical world. And that blue line represents possibly, or at least more or less, Abraham's journey from Ur through Canaan to Egypt and back. And all of the patriarchs go through some version of this journey. They're all traveling back and forth between these kingdoms and empires. And something that I think is really interesting is God calls them all to be shepherds and to be landless, although he promises Abraham that he'll inherit the land eventually. But for the time being, they're landless wanderers. And yet, all throughout the stories, they get tied up with cities and kings that, as shepherds and wanderers, they have no business even messing with that world. So I think that's just kind of fascinating, and it's sort of a lesson worth considering, that if God's calling you to one life, you shouldn't pine after a different one. So that pretty much gets us up to speed. We're at the end of the Bronze Age now, and so that brings us up to the Israelites' conquest of the land under Joshua. Well, wait, before I move on from there, it's worth remembering that the Middle Bronze Age was very sophisticated. There was very fine art, and there was literature, and there was complex religion. And the Late Bronze Age was also sophisticated and complex in a different way. It was a time of empires and wars, but then also international trade and diplomacy. And so it undermines a common misconception that a lot of people have, that history is sort of this linear progress upwards from like barbarism towards civilization. Really, history is more like a roller coaster, because the Bronze Age was very sophisticated, and soon it's going to come crashing down. And there was a systems collapse that was at least as catastrophic as the fall of the Roman Empire. I would argue that it might have been even more catastrophic than that. So that's something that's really worth keeping in mind when we read the biblical text, because that was a civilization-shattering event that most of us don't even learn about, in the history courses that we typically get. So that's worth emphasizing, because it really helps contextualize what's coming next. So this brings us to the book of Joshua and the Hebrews' conquest of the land. And I mentioned that the Late Bronze Age was a time of empires and armies. And at this period, which is about 1210 BC, Canaan was part of the Egyptian Empire. And so I think the conquest account is hard for a lot of us to read. There's all of this violence. It seems to glorify in violence. From our modern perspective, it sounds a lot like a genocide. And so a lot of us are understandably very uncomfortable with that. But I don't think that's quite what was going on. I think what Joshua and the Israelites were setting out to do was to break Egypt's hold on the land, because, like I mentioned, that was part of the Egyptian Empire. So before they could inherit the land, they needed to, first they had escaped from Egypt to the Promised Land, but now they needed to deliver the Promised Land from Egypt that still controlled it. So I think that's why the conquest is presented the way it is. It ends with this really interesting list of 32 kings that the Israelites killed, and it goes city by city and king by king, and then they make a point of saying one. So it's like the king of Gezer, so and so, one. And it's almost like they're doing a checking off a list. And so I don't think they were wiping out the population. I think they were breaking the power structure through which Egypt was ruling the region. And, that's not to sugarcoat it all. I mean, there was still violence, and there were still what we would consider innocent people getting killed. But I don't think it was this wholesale destruction that we imagine when we read it. And part of that is because they only ever attack cities and armies. I don't think that anywhere in the conquest narrative do they mention attacking a farm or a homestead. And that's where most of the population would have lived. This was an agrarian society. These were small family farms, homesteads who grew crops and raised livestock. That's where most of the people were, the ordinary people, whereas the rulers and the armies were in the cities. And that seemed to be what the Israelites were focused on. So to me, knowing that cultural, historical background helps that whole narrative to make a lot more sense to me. And I also think for anybody who's really bothered with the violence of that period, I think maybe that softens it a bit to contextualize that this wasn't about like ethnic cleansing. I think this was about breaking Egypt's hold on the land. And so part of that theory is based on something I mentioned last week, which was the Merneptah stela, where, before I get to that, let me talk about the conquest a little bit. So there's not a whole lot of direct evidence of the conquest. And part of that is because I don't think it was quite as catastrophic as an initial reading would suggest. Because the only cities that were said to have been completely destroyed and burned were Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And the biblical text makes a big deal about Jericho, and I think that's because it's the first city that they have to conquer, and so it's a huge milestone. That's when they had to trust God and cross the Jordan River, knowing that they were taking on this whole power structure. And so it was this hugely momentous step. And so because of that, we assume that Jericho must have been this enormous, important city. And it doesn't seem to have been. So that bothers a lot of people, because they expect late Bronze Jericho to be this massive, imposing city, and there just doesn't seem to have been a whole lot there. And so some people have used that to undermine Scripture, but I suggest that maybe it was a military outpost. So, maybe there was an army there because it guarded this important east to west road that ran past Jerusalem and then down through the valleys down to the Dead Sea. So it was a super important route. also Jericho has a very important water source. So I think that's why Scripture makes such a big deal of the fall of Jericho. Whereas by contrast, it kind of just mentions in passing that they burned down Hatzor. Well, when we excavated Hatzor, along with many other biblical cities, we discovered that Hatzor was one of the biggest and most politically important cities in the region. It was huge, it was thriving, there was major monumental architecture with temples and palaces. So that kind of goes to show that I don't think we can assume that what we would consider important was considered equally important by the biblical authors, because I think the Israelites really did burn down Jericho and really did burn down Hatzor, and yet what we find on the ground is almost opposite what we would expect. And I don't think that undermines Scripture in any way, but it's one of those things that's just kind of surprising and kind of makes you think maybe the Bible's priorities aren't my priorities, which that shouldn't be surprising. But when they excavated Hatzor, they found this structure which has been interpreted by some as a temple and by others as a palace. Doesn't really matter. I think it was a temple, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. What's significant for our story, looking at archaeology to illuminate the Bible, they discovered that somebody had taken pagan statues, pagan idols, and they had packed them into this structure, and they had burned it down with a fire so intense that it cracked the basalt stone panels that paneled the walls of the temple. And so you can see them pictured here. Those gray stones are the original basalt, which is to say volcanic rock that can stand up to very significant heat, and yet somebody burned it down so intensely that it cracked these basalt stone panels. And it's hard to identify any archaeological discovery with a historical event unless we have like explicit inscriptions, which is rare. But man, that sure sounds like something the Israelites would have done. So we can't say for certain that this is evidence of the Israelite conquest, but I would sure say that it's consistent with it. And let's see, that's just a double. So that kind of helps contextualize what we know of the destruction. And so at this point, the Israelites would have been preparing to take control of the land, of the promised land that they had been anticipating for generations. And I thought that this is a good point to go back to Exodus and reflect on God's promise of the land when He told the Israelites that they would enter a land flowing with milk and honey. And I think we've all heard that phrase before, and it's kind of an odd phrase to choose to describe a land. It makes sense that it seems to denote prosperity, but why choose that? It's especially odd because that region isn't particularly known for its bees or its beekeeping, so why honey? Some Bible scholars used to suggest that maybe it didn't even refer to honey as we understand it, but possibly to like the fruit of the date or the fig. And they kind of just came up with that because they didn't know what to make of the absence of beekeeping. But I think it was around 2010 or 2012 at Rehov. No, I think it was 2010. At a site in central Israel called Rehov, they found the first evidence of commercial beekeeping in Canaan. So what you're looking at there is these cylindrical beehives, and it's just a tube just about that big, made out of sun-dried mud brick, and it just provided a place for the bees to live. And so here is one of the preserved hives individually to get you an idea of what it would have been like. And then on the left, a reconstruction of what the whole complex might have looked like. And I got to dig it at Rehov, I think it was 2012 when I was there, and it had been a couple years before that they found the hives. So I didn't get to work on the hives proper, but I got to see right where it was, and so that was cool. So it's a site called Rehov in the Beit Shan Valley. Let me show you a map here. It would have been close to Mount Gilboa, up south of the Galilee, if you see. So it's up there near Beit Shan, up in the middle of the country. But I just thought that was cool. I wasn't really sure where to include that, but this seemed like as good a place as any. So that brings us back to the Hebrews, and so they have killed all these kings. They have knocked out all these power centers. And now, presumably, they go in and take the land that has been promised to them. And yet, when we read in Scripture, the next thing it notes is the beginning of the book of Judges, where everything is in chaos. And the Israelites are fighting Philistines, which where did they come from? They haven't talked about Philistines before. And they're fighting what's left of the Canaanites, and when they get bored with that, they're fighting each other. So, what happened? It's kind of weird if you think about it. I don't know how many times I went from reading Joshua to reading Judges and didn't even really give that any thought. But it's kind of weird that they just conquered the land, were victorious. You would have thought they would have been on a high of faithfulness to God and their people and their tribes, and yet they go from victory to defeat. And so what happened? And the Bible doesn't tell us, but I think archaeology gives us a really important clue. So I mentioned this last week, of how Pharaoh Merneptah recorded having led a military campaign to pacify several enemies who had rebelled against him, and among them were the Israelites. And so I think that's what happened between the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. I think the conquest happened much like the book of Joshua suggests, but then the Egyptians came back. And for whatever reason, the biblical authors didn't choose to include that. But, it's not contrary to Scripture in any way. It's just kind of fitting what we know of history with what we know of the biblical story. And so I think that makes a lot of sense, that the Israelites took the land, but then the Egyptians came in and kind of scattered them when Merneptah led this campaign. Unfortunately, there's really nothing preserved of his campaign against the Israelites, which is not surprising because they weren't a landed people yet. They were still wanderers. So Pharaoh Merneptah claims that he fought Israel, the people of Israel, but we just don't really see that in archaeology because, I mean, think how hard it is to find a battle site just from like 200 years ago. Like, imagine that there was some catastrophic battle between early settlers out here and, the Cherokee or, whoever they were coming up against back in the frontier times. It could have been a catastrophic battle with thousands of people killed, but good luck finding it now unless there's, somebody thought to put up a sign. You would just have to, chance upon it. So we shouldn't be surprised that we don't really see any evidence of Merneptah's campaign against Israel. But we do see evidence of Merneptah's campaign because before he mentions laying waste to Israel, he also says that he seized upon Gezer. So Gezer is a site, an ancient city in Israel, and you'll see it on this map just northwest of Jerusalem. It's been described as the gateway of Jerusalem. So a very important site. And that's one of the cities that Merneptah was said to have made war against. And I dug there, I think it was 2018, somewhere around there, and I actually excavated part of Merneptah's destruction. So here's an aerial view of the city. There's not a whole lot to see from a distance. It is a ruin. But I think we're looking at the Middle Bronze Gate here, or what's left of it. Even though there's not a whole lot to see. Now there is they did excavators long before I worked there. I think it was back in the 70s. Excavators discovered a Canaanite high place, which Michelle made me take a selfie, and so this was my very first of very few selfies that I've ever taken, and I took it by the Canaanite high place at Gezer. So archaeology does tell us that this was a very major city, and it also was destroyed catastrophically at the end of the Bronze Age, and we think it was Merneptah. So in the same campaign that he fought the Israelites, he also wiped out this city. So this is a house right by the city gate, and I excavated. It was kind of adjacent to room A in this plan. I was just to the left of A, which was a late Bronze Age house. We were able to date its construction pretty securely because I found a foundation deposit, which sometimes they would do that almost like a time capsule. In this case, it was 2 bowls with a lamp inside of them, and we find that sometimes buried under the foundation of a major building, and we don't really know why. If it was had some sort of cultic or magical significance, or or if it was just like a good luck charm, like breaking a bottle of wine against a ship or something like that. But we find that sometimes, and in this case, we were able to date it date the age of this building pretty securely based on the type of pottery we found very clearly associated with it under the foundation. And so we dated it pretty securely to the late Bronze Age. And as we're excavating, we're finding evidence of a terrible destruction, of fires and collapse. And so it seems like this whole section of the city burned and collapsed and was probably vacant for an extended time after that. And we actually found the remains of two people in that house. The one on the left was a woman, and she was preserved in a way that I have never seen before, because you can actually kind of see the one on the right was the woman, and you can kind of see the outline of her body, which is very strange. I think what happened was minerals filled in the cavity that she left when the building collapsed around her, and it left something like a cast, kind of like the plaster cast that they intentionally did with the ruins of Pompeii. But I think something much like that happened here naturally. And so we were able to find the remains of this woman, and then in the entrance of the building, crushed under the rubble, we found the remains of a man, and that's the skeleton on the left. And so it's impossible to know what happened, but it's tempting to interpret it as this being a couple, and perhaps he was the husband trying to rescue his wife from this burning building, and he ran in just as it collapsed, and so they were both sealed in for 3,000 years. So that really drove home to me just the reality of history. Like, it's so easy to read these stories and just think of dates and names and things that are hard to remember and hard to pronounce. But you find something like that, and you're reminded that these were real people who lived real lives. And just kind of as an aside, I really don't like excavating human remains, especially burials. I really don't like to disturb burials because I think it's important how we treat our dead. Our hope is in the resurrection, and so I think we should hold human remains as having dignity and deserving respect. So I really don't like disturbing them. But in cases like this where people are lost, I kind of hope that they would find some comfort in the fact that we found them, 3,000 years later, and made an effort to learn what we could about them. So I always try to be respectful whenever I have to handle human remains, and just remember that they're real people who really lived, and do what I can to learn about their lives and their story. So yeah, that is some archaeology that we can relate pretty closely to the biblical account, that the Israelites attacked Canaan, Merneptah attacked the Israelites, and at the same time, he attacked this city that I just showed you. So while we don't have direct archaeological evidence, certain archaeological evidence of the conquest, there's a lot that we can look at and say that that the biblical account is pretty plausible. So that brings us back to the end of the Bronze Age. I mentioned that we were coming up on this catastrophic collapse, and the Israelites, Merneptah fought against the Israelites around 1210 BC. Shortly after that, a group of people known as the Sea Peoples started moving throughout the Mediterranean. And this map shows all the cities they burned and all of the battles that they fought. And so they started out in the Aegean, quite possibly having something to do with the Trojan War, which is kind of interesting. The Trojan War probably really happened to some extent. There probably wasn't really an Odysseus who took 20 years getting home, but who knows? But there was a major war around the city of Troy around the same time. And after that, these people who may have been refugees from the war started sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean. You might be wondering why I'm talking about them, because they don't seem directly pertinent to the Bible, but they will be. So they sweep through the eastern Mediterranean, and they wind up on the frontier of Egypt. And they had gone through basically just taking out everybody they came across. The late bronze system was probably already destabilized. A lot of people think that there had been famine, possibly caused by droughts. It's hard to know for sure. But this was a really rough time to be alive in the world. This international system that had existed for centuries was crumbling. And the migration of the Sea Peoples was part of kind of the last gasp of that civilization. So they knocked out all of these little kingdoms throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and then were stopped at the frontier of Egypt. And the Egyptians were able to basically fight them to a draw. And Egypt didn't collapse as a civilization, but this was basically their last moment on the world stage, save for one resurgence in a couple hundred years, which I'll talk about next week. Among the Sea Peoples were a group that became the Philistines. And so that's why they weren't really mentioned before in the story. There are a couple of isolated references to Philistines like I think back in Abraham's time. But it's hard to really know what to do with that. Like maybe they just referred to anybody from the Aegean as Philistines. But they certainly weren't major players in the biblical story before now. And yet, during the period of the Judges and the early monarchy, they were the major enemy of Israel. But interestingly, I think they also helped allow Israel to take the land, because Egypt had come in and beat up on the Israelites, but the Sea Peoples had fought Egypt to a draw. And so they kind of swapped out as Israel's primary enemy. So I guess the enemy of my enemy is not always my friend, is one thing to take away from that. But that was kind of the end of Egypt's dominance of the region, and yet they emerged as a new foe of the early Israelites. And so, of course, they're significant in the book of Judges. Samson fights Philistines significantly, and then they are still the primary enemy of Israel at the time of Saul and David. So just to kind of reiterate, this, the early Iron Age was a post-collapse period. So when we're reading the book of Judges with all its chaos and violence, we're kind of reading about, it was kind of ancient Mad Max times. So that's reflected in Scripture as the judges and the very early monarchy. But that kind of helps contextualize the violence we see in a lot of those stories, because it was just a violent world. They had to fight for their place in it. And so slowly, people would settle down and start rebuilding systems, and tribes would turn into kingdoms, and we see that all throughout the region. And we see that reflected in the biblical stories of Saul and David. And so that brings us to the life of David and his role in both in subduing the Philistines and then in establishing Israel as not only a kingdom but a major power player in the region. And so this kind of helps you imagine sort of the regional struggle. You had the Philistines on the coast and the hill country, and the Israelites in inland, in sort of between the hill country and the Judean wilderness. And they're both fighting to control their respective territories while also trying to expand their territories. And into that context, we have the David and Goliath story. And so I think archaeology can tell us quite a bit about this. So Goliath is, of course, described as this enormous, hulking giant of a man. But other than his size, he is described looking very much like a warrior of the sea peoples. Those people who swept through Egypt and then settled in Canaan. And this is a carving from Egypt. I think it's from the time of Ramesses III, who was the pharaoh who fought the sea peoples to a draw. And this is a depiction of one of the sea peoples' warriors. And it reflects many details from the description of Goliath. So 1 Samuel describes Goliath as wearing a bronze helmet, which we see here. He had a shield. He had a shield bearer. Here, this soldier is shown holding his own shield. He had a coat of scale armor, which this warrior is wearing something. It's hard to know if that was fabric or armor. I've seen it reconstructed either way, but it very well could have been armor, just like is described with Goliath. And then Goliath was armed with a a bronze-tipped spear, which we see this soldier armed with a spear. He was also armed with javelins and a sword, and some of the other soldiers shown in this same inscription are armed with javelins or swords. So we see all of this reflected in what we know of the warfare of the period. So I just think that's cool. And then we have, of course, young David defeating this warrior with a sling. And it was such an unfair fight that it's almost become like, an image that everybody uses to describe any unfair fight. The David versus Goliath struggle. And they were certainly mismatched. But I'm going to suggest that it wasn't quite as one-sided as we might think. Because sometimes, you grow up hearing this in Sunday school, and I always got the impression, well, first of all, when I heard about a sling, when I was young, I thought of like the Dennis the Menace sling that every little boy plays with and shoots cans and shoots cats when his mom's not looking, and so you think of like a toy, but actually, a sling in the ancient world was a serious weapon. It was, I actually have one. I should have brought it. Why did I not bring that? It's a pouch with two strips, usually of leather, a couple feet long, and you whip it around, which I've tried to do several times, and I don't know how they did it, because I certainly can't. But you whip it around and use the leverage of those swinging straps, sort of like a spear thrower. And so you can fling a stone with incredible velocity, and if you know what you're doing better than I do, with impressive accuracy. I've seen videos of people doing this, and it's amazing. Like I would not want to, I would not want somebody coming after me with one of these. So while it's not like, it's not like a modern firearm, it also was not a toy. So here, we see Assyrian soldiers from about 300 years after David's time, armed with slings as they attack the city of Lachish, which I'll talk more about the assault on Lachish next week. But that's just an example of how slings were serious weapons in the ancient world. And so I don't intend that to take anything away from David. Like, this was still very impressive, but it wasn't like the little boy with his cute little toy going up against a warrior. It was maybe more like a cowboy with his deer rifle going up against a fully armed soldier, which that's also plenty impressive. Like, if you've got a bolt-action rifle and the other guy has full body armor and an M4 and everything, it's still a mismatch, but somebody who's really good with a rifle might get lucky. And I think that's kind of what happened in the David and Goliath story. So, of course, David wins. He comes up against this warrior, and he was outmatched. This was a fully armed warrior, apart from him being described as a giant. This was a professional warrior going up against a herdsman, like a teenage cowboy in our culture. So I just think that's really cool, kind of seeing seeing ancient slings in action, as it were, and that kind of is helping contextualize this story. So I think when the Hebrews sent David out, they knew that he was really outmatched, but also I'll bet they knew that this kid knows how to use a sling and he might get lucky. So another significant detail in the story that is reflected in archaeology is the fact that Goliath is armed with a sword. We might think, well, of course he was armed with a sword. It's the ancient world, people had swords. But that was actually kind of new technology at this point. In the Bronze Age, swords were very rare and very expensive. And only the most elite warrior would have been armed with a sword. And they were quite small. So this is pretty similar to the swords that were used in this period. And it's also quite similar to a gladius, a Roman gladius. So it went on to be a really prolific style of weapon. But that was pretty new on the scene at this time. So the fact that Goliath was armed with a sword suggests that he was a pretty highly regarded warrior, which isn't surprising given his description. But the fact that he was armed with a sword is more significant than you might assume based on our assumption that like, oh yeah, people just have always had swords around. So David becomes king, but he's not really a proper king. He sort of goes, under his leadership, Israel kind of goes from being a band of warlike tribes to being a true kingdom. And so starting out, David is almost like a warlord. Like he's going out and he's fighting the Philistines, and he's on the run for a period. He's working as a mercenary. It's still a pretty sketchy world. But by the end of his reign, he has established a real kingdom. And so his son Solomon inherits that, and he goes on to forge it into a real center of power, which there's a lot of debate over whether or not that really happened. I think it's quite plausible that it did, but other people have argued that there's no evidence for it. And so I will get into that shortly. But I think at the very least, the biblical description of Solomon's Jerusalem fits into what we know of this period. So as I've said, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire had both collapsed. But after a couple centuries of chaos, we start to see little kingdoms, little city-states emerge and start to impose some structure on the region. And as they pop up, they all seem to follow the same architectural pattern. This is actually what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, was monumental architecture in the early Iron Age. And what I noticed is that all of the cities that are either established or rebuilt early in the Iron Age, they follow the same basic pattern where they have a walled citadel organized around a large open space, like a courtyard, and there's usually a palace or an administrative building, and there's usually a temple. And that's what we see, that's how we see Solomon's Jerusalem described. And so I shared this description of Solomon's Jerusalem, and I want you to compare it to this plan of an ancient citadel. And so he built the palace of the forest of Lebanon, which is a huge pillared structure. Now, to me, that looks a lot like the building designated D on this plan. Do y'all see that? He made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. So he built this big open courtyard. And to me, that looks an awful lot like the central courtyard off of the pillared structure in this plan. So moving on from there, he built the throne hall, the hall of justice where he was to judge. And the palace in which he was to live set farther back and was similar in design. Well, that's somewhat like the configuration of buildings E and F, where we have a palace with an open portico that would have been designed for semi-public use, where people would come to see the king, and then farther back, building F was a private residence. So on this citadel, we see everything from Solomon's Jerusalem, but this isn't Jerusalem, this is Hattusha, the capital of the Hittites. And so I think Hattusha helped establish a style of architecture that, for whatever reason, all of the little kingdoms that popped up in the Iron Age copied. Maybe because a few cities like this survived, and so when you're looking around for something to base your new capital on, you based it on what's already there, which was this. But also, from the biblical perspective, I think this is significant because Canaan had been controlled by Egypt for centuries. So there would have been Egyptian models to base this on. Solomon could have built Jerusalem based on Egyptian styles, which still would have been there in ruins. They still would have been visible. They could have done that. And yet, Solomon employed, I think it was Hiram of Damascus, the Phoenician king, to build his city. And I think it may be significant that he chose to do that because if they had just escaped from Egyptian captivity, well, I say just, it was a couple hundred years, but still, if that's you don't soon forget the experience of captivity. There would have been a level of animosity towards Egyptian culture, and so if you're a new young king in Iron Age Canaan, and you want to build a magnificent capital, you either look to Egypt for the model or you look to the north, to Syro-Hittite space for the model. And so I think the fact that he seems to have looked north, that might support the validity of the Exodus tradition. That they may have consciously chosen to not model themselves after the Egyptians, but instead after their northern neighbors. So I think that's just cool. Again, it's reading between the lines and using archaeology to illuminate Scripture. And so we don't know for sure, but I think it makes sense. So something we don't see on this citadel is a temple. There was a temple at Hattusha, but it was a different part of the city. Hattusha was an enormous, vast city, and so kind of naturally, the much smaller cities that popped up later didn't mirror it exactly because they just couldn't. It would be like Weatherford. Why don't you have all the amenities of New York City? It's like, well, it's a different scale. But many of these small citadel cities that popped up in the Iron Age, I think, like Jerusalem, they did feature a temple adjacent to these courtyards and palaces like we see here. And many of them look very much like the biblical description of Solomon's temple. On the left, we have an artist's reconstruction of Solomon's temple based on the biblical description. On the right, we have an ancient Syrian temple. I think this is from Ain Dara, which is an ancient Syro-Anatolian site. But it's almost exactly the same floor plan as Solomon's temple. So it's kind of like last week where I compared the chest of Anubis to the Ark of the Covenant. And on the one hand, it's cool when we can see known historical parallels to things in Scripture. On the other hand, it can be kind of disappointing, like because you read about things in Scripture and you expect them to be unique, but God works through existing cultures, and God called Solomon to build his temple, and Solomon employed a Phoenician to do it. So it shouldn't be surprising if the temple winds up looking a lot like the kind of temples the Phoenicians knew. And what was important was the kind of worship that went on there. So God chose to reveal himself in this time and space, and so we shouldn't be surprised if Scripture reflects this time and space. So Solomon did a lot of other building too. And this brings me to the part where there is either a lot of evidence for Solomon's building projects or there's none. And so that's kind of weird. But what we have is we have a biblical account that Solomon fortified Jerusalem, which unfortunately we can't really excavate much of Jerusalem. It's still a living city. It's one of the holiest sites in the world. So, you can't go bulldozing, the old city of Jerusalem to just hope to find something. It's not practical. But he also fortified Gezer, Megiddo, and Hatzor. And archaeologists found very similar gate and wall systems at all three of these sites. And so a lot of people think that those could have been Solomon's gates and Solomon's walls. And a lot of people will refer to that as Solomonic architecture. But unfortunately, it's not certain. In archaeology, especially this far back, we're dating things based on tree ring data and ceramic typology, looking at different shapes of lamps and pots and whatnot. This was centuries before coins emerged. When coins come around, dating gets a lot easier, because if you have a coin of Darius the First, you could be pretty sure what time period you're looking at. But this predates coins by several hundred years. So there's like a degree of legitimate disagreement about the dating of these things is completely reasonable. So some people date these structures to Solomon's times. Other archaeologists believe that it dated a generation later. So unfortunately, if anybody asks if there's direct evidence for Solomon's building projects, you can say yes, quite a bit, but also maybe none, depending on how you interpret the data. So, Personally, I think it's quite plausible that it could have been built by Solomon. Um, if it wasn't, that doesn't ruin my faith. Solomon could have built some different gate, but there are legitimate disagreements between professional archaeologists just based on how you interpret the data. Now, another structure that dates to around the same time as the Megiddo gate complex that might be Solomon's Gate is this palace, also at Megiddo. Interestingly, I don't need to get into that. Never mind. I was about to go down a really nerdy architectural thing that you guys should be glad that I stopped myself from. This is a palace that dates to the same time as that may have dated to Solomon's times, and some people have suggested that the palace in Jerusalem might have been built on the same plan. So again, we can't know for sure. We can't excavate on the Temple Mount because it's a highly contested holy site. Muslims are not going to tolerate us digging up the pavement next to the Dome of the Rock. So, and for that matter, Solomon's temple was destroyed, a second temple was built, Herod built a third temple, that was destroyed by the Romans. So even if we could get in there and excavate, there is no guarantee that there's any evidence, any archaeological evidence left. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It's just sometimes preservation is just a gamble, and some things survive and some things don't. But if this dates to the time of Solomon, which it may, then that might also give us an idea of what his palace in Jerusalem looked like. And so I just thought that was pretty neat. So back to the question related to the question of whether or not Solomon built these structures or if it was a later king, there's also a debate in archaeology and biblical studies over whether David and Solomon were even real people. I think they were, but some people say no, that they were just legendary figures, like King Arthur. I'm silly enough that I think King Arthur was probably a real guy too, but some people will say that Solomon's Jerusalem was this legendary time that didn't really exist, and later authors were trying to glorify their history by creating a past that didn't really exist. I don't think we have to believe that. I think the way the Bible describes Solomon's Jerusalem is very consistent with what we know of the time and the area. And a clue that doesn't prove that David and Solomon were real, but I think strongly suggest it, dates to a couple generations after his time, and way up north at Dan, which you may remember me talking about Dan last week, because that was where the Abrahamic gate was, that middle bronze gate that Abraham may well have walked through. Well, in the Iron Age levels of that site, archaeologists discovered this inscription dating to about 100 years after David, maybe not quite that, about 100 years after David, referring to the house of David as a political faction in the region. And so this was written by Hazael, an Aramean king, but he talks about Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, And then he also talks about the king of Judah, which he refers to as the house of David. So this is less than a century from David's time. If David wasn't a real guy, it would be really weird that they were referring to him in this way. I mean, it'd be a little bit like if archaeologists in 1,000 years find a $5 bill from 1920, and they're like, well, Abraham Lincoln, like he was clearly this mythic figure, like he was so significant to the mythology of America that well, he probably wasn't a real guy. He was just this mythic figure that they put on their money. Well, that'd be ridiculous. Like, why would you do that? So in the same way, I think this inscription, which refers to the house of David, not all that long after his time, I think is a very strong suggestion that David was a real figure, and also that Solomon was a real figure. And as I've discussed, I think Solomonic Jerusalem seems quite plausible to me based on what we know of his time and space. So that's where I'm going to wrap up this week. So this has been the emergence of Israel as a people and a kingdom, and then the united monarchy. Next week, I'll talk about how the monarchy splits into two rival kingdoms, and then how they each fall and are dispersed. And I'll talk about the captivity of Judah in Babylon and how that led to the rise of early Judaism. So that'll be next week, but this wraps up my talk today. And I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge I lost an important person in my life this week. Dr. Tom Davis was one of my doctoral professors, and so he was one of the guys who taught me in my doctoral coursework, and he was also the director of the field project in Sudan, where I got to oversee the excavation of Taharka's mortuary temple. And so he has been a really influential person to me and to many people. He has been he was a major voice in the archaeological community, and he was a devout believer, and so he was an example of a Christian scholar in a world where most scholars aren't believers anymore. And so I just think he was just a really important light to many people, and so he was loved and respected by his colleagues and his students, and so I'm grateful to have been one of his students and also to have been his friend. And we went on a heck of an adventure in Sudan a couple years ago, and I'm really grateful to have been able to do that. But we lost him this week after a year-long battle with cancer, and so that's been a hard loss to me and to many other people. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge him, and to the extent that this was interesting and that it sounds like I know what I'm talking about, a lot of that is thanks to Tom Davis. And if it wasn't entertaining, you can blame it on somebody else. So that's all I have for you. Next week we'll continue with the divided monarchy through the rise of early Judaism. And I'll talk about our expedition in Sudan and how that ties into the Assyrian assault on Jerusalem. So do we have time for questions or comments? I'm happy to take questions or comments if if y'all have any.